Steve's that microphone on? Microphone on?
That's how you want to appear on a worldwide circuit.
You know what, I really don't care, I'm in trouble.
And you're going to be out before the
Yeah,
trial.
drive too quick though.
You might be surprised, let's see how this goes.
Those are shoes you gonna wear?
Doctor, I will remind you, you are still under oath in this proceeding.
Yes, Your Honor.
Good. Talk about
Let's just talk about our first subject matter real quick. The issue of how you analyze electric current. Heard some testimony from people.
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, can you keep your voice up? I can't hear you. Or maybe move back.
Why don't I move back a little further? You might be the first person ever to say they couldn't hear my
Want a
voice.
microphone?
No, I think I'm good. I'm listening to myself twice would be too much. Sorry?
Please.
I didn't know we were doing it.
It's not you, Scott.
Yesterday you complained there was no air, today there's air.
No, not complaining. It's good with the air, we just need a lot of voice.
There was no complaint.
Scott, you look pretty good walking around. Here comes Gabe.
We're good? Danny.
How come they're all moving and I'm not moving?
Oh, you talk about the camera. Let's go.
All right, let's go, Mr. Adams.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Throughout these hearings, you personal testimony regarding the manner in which you analyze the different electric diagrams in this case. You recall that?
Yes,
You were here for all that testimony?
I was.
I want to go back and get into a little more detail regarding the manner in which you knew that. Tell us again, when you receive information, the first set of information you received in this case you got from DSO,
That's correct.
and did that include electrophorograms of evidence collected in this case?
It did.
When you do your analysis on each individual piece of evidence, where do you start? With each electrophonogram, what's the first thing you do?
Well, first I actually start with the electrophorograms. I pull those out, put all the other information in the case aside so that I'm only looking at the evidence electrophorograms, and I review those one at a time.
Let's take just one,
Okay?
all right? With that first, regardless of what number it was, a single electrophonogram of evidence collected in this case. Tell us how you start that process. What's the first thing you look at?
Overall, I look at the general quality of the electrophonogram, which includes, how many peaks I'm looking at each locus. I look at the internal lane standard. I'll look at the baseline. Just the entire story of a sample is written on the electrophonogram. So I am looking now at sort of the preliminary chapters in that story by looking at the overall quality, how many loci appear to have results, all that things. So I have a general idea of the quality of the sample and how much DNA.
Regarding your experience looking at those electrophorograms, if you know, when you got your electrophorograms from BSO, did you know what type of machine or instrument they were generated on?
By looking at the electrophorograms and the data, this work was done on a ABI 310.
I'm sorry. Couldn't hear you.
An ABI 310. And what is an ABI 310?
It's a single capillary genetic analyzer. It was one of the early models of genetic analyzers for forensics that Applied Biosystems built, and they've been around for decades.
What are they called again?
Genetic analyzers.
Did you say bio?
Yeah, let's
Applied
clarify.
biosystems.
Thank you.
When you said an ABI 310, are you talking about applied biosystems? Is that what ABI is referencing?
That's correct, Applied Biosystems Incorporated. They've been a number of different company names over the decades, but the general parlance is to call them, ABI 310s, or even just more short than that, 310.
You were given some testimony earlier in this case indicating that you were a co-founder of Voting Technologies, correct?
That's correct.
When you say co-founder, were you just an administrator? I think you said you did more than that, right?
I was the chief scientific officer, lab director, and also served as a DNA analyst when it needed to be.
Do you recall what types of machines or instruments you had in voting?
We had ABI 310s, as well as a number of other machines from the Applied Biosystems group, but we certainly had ABI 310s.
Can you tell the court, please, how many ABI 310 analyzers did you have up and running and voting at any one time?
Typically, it was about 30.
In the course of your professional career as an analyst and as a scientist, can you tell the court, please, how many times have you examined electropharograms generated on an ABI 310?
Thousands.
Are you familiar with the operation of that machine or that instrument?
Yes.
Did you, as chief science officer for voting, validate 310s?
Yes, many times.
Have you ever trained an analyst how to use a 310?
Yes, again, many times.
You teach them the same things you're describing in terms of how to make an assessment on an electropharogram?
Yes.
Let's get more specific about what that is. You've heard a lot of testimony regarding peaks, and I think we've even seen slideshows of the different marks and graphs. There's been a lot of talk about the height of a peak. Is that a fact?
It is one of the factors you look at, yes.
One of the factors?
One. You also look at the shape of that peak. You look at the location of that peak, and you look at peaks that might be around it at a particular location. Is that peak?
Easel?
The easel? Yeah.
I think it's
I know we have a lot of high-tech stuff on the dinosaur, so we're going to use an easel.
I didn't hear anybody take issue with that.
We're going to do it so at least I understand.
Okay.
Right here would be fine. Yeah, do you want a black marker? I don't really care what color it is. Sharp would be fine.
red and green?
Yeah, that's fine. They're popular colors, we'll stick with that. All right. So, and guys, if you have any trouble seeing, let me know, and we'll just, wherever you want to sit. But I'm going to draw a line, I'm going to call that the bottom. And maybe you can come on down here with me, if that's all right with the court, so you can stand right next to me.
Absolutely fine.
All right? Assuming this is where you would find your peaks on an electropharogram, you indicated something regarding locus, an individual locus where you would expect to find information.
Right.
Are they continuous all along this line?
They will go along that line, but there will be breaks between the loci where you don't expect to see peaks. So you may see 4 or 5 loci along the entire line, but they'll be discontinuous. They don't just lay up against each other.
All right, so that's why I was asking the question. So without getting into the technicality of where a particular locus is on any line, would it be fair to say that if you were looking at a graph, for example, you might find loci in these individuals and there might be open spaces in between?
Correct.
All right? So when you're telling a court where you would expect to see information, are you referencing where you're looking here at individual loci?
Yes.
Okay? What about all these spaces in between here? What if you see peaks in between here?
Well, it indicates we've got some kind of artifact that has to be dealt with, or it could be that the overall quality of the sample is very low. We may discount the loci on either side. All of this information comes into play when you evaluate the data you get on an electropherogram.
But, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're trying to make a determination about human DNA and what is of value, whether it's to exclude a suspect or to include a suspect, how valuable is this information in between?
Only in terms of assessing the overall quality of the electropherogram. The human DNA will be located in these areas where you've drawn the L for locus, because those are the places where we've programmed and built the reagents to find and assess the human DNA.
Okay? So, if you found a series of peaks in these open spaces, wherever they were, and you would use that to be able to determine how valuable the information would be in these particular loci, correct?
Correct, and it could also give you an indication, for example, if you see peaks in these other places, you may have bleed through from other channels, which would suggest that the instrument isn't performing properly. So again, this gives you sort of this overall assessment of the quality of the data and the utility of the information you're seeing.
Take your seat for a second. When you're talking about making assessments in the manner in which you just described, you're trying to distinguish and tell us, when you say human DNA, what is that? On that graph, what would you call that? Is that an allele?
It's an allele at a locus, and alleles at a locus. If you have a mixture, it might be multiple alleles at a locus, but it is specific peaks of DNA in the proper locations within the locus to be determined to be good quality.
Now, in looking at an overall sample, is it fair to say that there are things that, and I think you've already answered this, but that can interfere with your ability to read it?
Yes.
Noise.
Noise can certainly...
Is noise one? Fair enough. Is noise one of those factors?
Yes, noise is one of those factors.
Can you explain that to the court, please?
Well, effectively, noise is the electronic signature of the machine in any electronic device. I don't care if it's your telephone, a calculator, a computer, a DNA analyzer. There's going to be a certain amount of electronic signal. We call that noise. And what we want to know is our data rising above the noise level? In some machines, even if they've been properly calibrated, the machine may decide to not act properly, and you may get distorted noise levels which would interfere with your ability to analyze the data. You may see absolutely normal noise levels that make it easy to analyze the data, and you may see other artifacts down in what we would call the baseline region that would influence how you determine the overall quality of the data.
All right, let's stay away for a moment from artifacts and just talk about the noise level. All right? As it relates specifically to noise, can you look at noise in terms of location and shape of the peak? Is that a factor in determining noise?
Sure.
So that, and does it have its own type of signal where you can distinguish noise when you're looking at it?
Sure. I mean, noise will have, it'll be multiple small electronic signatures down in the region of the baseline, and you characterize that when you did your internal validation of the machine. You characterize this information so that you have it available to you, but you also look at it routinely when you're analyzing the data, because of course it's part of that overall story of how the sample was processed.
And when you were talking before about things, The instrument, that particular machine that we're talking about, a 310 genetic analyzer, it has little safeguards within the does it have safeguards within the electropharogram to tell you whether the instrument is working properly?
Sure, you have things like spatial calibration, you have other instrument metrics, if you will, that allow you to assess that this machine worked properly. And you can see that in the electropharogram. That's where all of that data sort of comes together to tell you that story.
Now, if we put aside noise from the machine, and we put aside the human DNA of the wheels at a particular locus, you mentioned something else, an artifact. What is that?
It can be a number of different things. It can be, if it's at the lowest molecular weights early on the left side of that drawing you have, it might be dye blobs, for want of a better term. This is simply small pieces of DNA and dye that have come down the capillary early, and they'll give you a signal way before you get to the human DNA section. That's an artifact.
All right, and we're going to get ahead to RFUs in a second, but you said capillaries and dye, so let's be very specific on the operation of all of these different instruments. Can you describe, in the most simplistic of terms for me, who is not a scientist, when you're talking about putting dye in a machine and getting a result, what is that?
Okay, what we do is when the DNA is isolated, we tag it with fluorescent dyes, and 4 different dyes. And then what that means is that when we separate the DNA out by size in the capillary, that we can read the size of that DNA by looking at the intensity of the dye and the speed at which it came down the capillary. You can think about it this way. If I take a 6-foot pole and a 6-inch pole, and I give you the 6-foot pole and I tell you to put it across your shoulders and run through some thick woods, you're going to have to stop, you're going to have to move, and you're going to go slow. If I put the 6-inch piece of stick on my shoulder, I'm going to move right through because I don't have to stop and turn and get out of the way. The capillary does that. So the capillary acts as the woods, if you will, to separate the large pieces of DNA from the small. And when we get to the bottom, as they come out over time, we can generate the length of the DNA, and the color tells us what locus.
All right, now all of what you just described in terms of how you do your analysis, at the time you're doing that in a given sample, in a given piece of evidence sample, an electropharogram, where's the reference standard that you'll be comparing to?
Nowhere. I haven't looked at the reference standard yet. I have no idea what the reference is. I don't look at the reference sample until I'm completely done analyzing this sample.
And when you say analyzing, you catalog this information?
Yes, I catalog all of the information in the sample. I know the peaks, the loci where it appears that I have all of the information available, loci where drop in and drop out may have occurred. I've looked at peaks that may be below analytical but above the noise level to determine whether they should be examined. All of that information is known, and I've even gotten to the point where it's pretty clear these are the loci that would eventually be used in a calculation if we ever get to that point.
And just so we're clear, when you say get to that point, why wouldn't you get to that point?
Well, if it turns out that the person to be compared to the data is excluded, then that's absolute and there is no calculation.
All right, we'll come back to the issue of exclusion. Let me just, if you would, please, give a copy of your prior testimony.
The one that I was shown when I was, I think, actually, the excerpt of my
Yes, right,
testimony.
Testimony here or deposition?
No, the testimony here that everyone referred to. We had a little printout of it. I think you may have put the, here we go. Let me just show you what I'm referring to.
You're not talking about the entire testimony, just an excerpt.
That's right, it's just the excerpt. It's a couple of pages. I think you put the whole thing in, but
I did.
this is the excerpt. this from earlier.
What's the date, the 19th?
April 19th, 11 a.m.
April 19th at 11 a.m., that is correct. I want to direct your attention to page 3. Go down, if you will, to line 11, where the question is asked, tell us the process you use. For clarification purposes, if you will, beginning on line 12, your answer, will you read until I tell you to stop?
All right? When I look at an electropharogram, you can tell right away if you're looking at a mixture or a single source sample, a partial sample, or full profile sample. You can look at the RFU values, the morphology of the actual peaks on the electropharogram. You go through sort of an entire mental scenario, if you will, where you pick through all of the things you expect to see.
Stop there. When you testified earlier and you talked about what you expect to see, was that are you looking at the reference sample that you expect to see? You're comparing it to something?
No, I'm not looking, I haven't looked at the reference sample yet. The reference sample is even close to the process sample.
When you say expect to see, is that based on the analysis you just testified to here today?
Yes, exactly.
In terms of is it in reference to the locus and whether you'd expect to find things in a given locus and noise levels and all those other factors?
Yes, all of those other factors, those are the things I'm expecting to see. Am I expecting to see, for example, a clean baseline? Right? I am expecting to see a clean baseline, and if I don't see it, then I need to be able to understand it and determine how it affects my interpretation.
Now, if you would, please back up. I think it is on what would be still page 3, line 21, and read again.
If you see peak height imbalance or balance, what is the source of the DNA on the sample? How many loci are present? All 15? Fewer than 15. Are there more than 2 peaks per locus? This might mean if it is a single locus, you have 1 or 2 spikes, probably an artifact. 3 or 4 loci and several peaks that look like peaks, it's probably a mixture. You go through, you do all of these things, catalog all of the information, take great pains to look at all of the individual DNA peaks, then you catalog all of that information. Once you've completed that, you have effectively determined, what is there, then that effectively becomes fixed. Then you can look at your reference samples because you have to make a comparison.
Stop. When you say have to make a comparison, why do you have to make a comparison then?
Well, you have to be able to answer the question, is the person who's being accused, if this is a criminal case, or the person who is, possibly the father in a paternity case, you have to be able to answer the question, are they excluded? And then, if they're not excluded, what does that mean?
So we're clear. At any point in this hearing or any other time, if you're ever given testimony that you look at a reference sample in order to determine what peaks to use, what loci to consider for your analysis.
Just take a break. Well, I just need something. I don't have it here. It's right here. Please get it.
Why not? We're on a break. Well, no, if you'll just let us know when you're ready.
Yeah, that's everything.
Are we going to be more than 5 minutes? Because I'm not to sit on the witness stand.
We got it.
Oh, we have it already? Okay. It was going to be a long break. I was going to tell me it's going to be simple. Okay.
Just so you know.
Are you trying to highlight or no? Your head's cut off.
So you think that there's 2 hours on the waiting for a decision, Judge, for a trial? I have sent it in 2 weeks ago, and said we received it in.
Okay? Hello again, Doc.
Hello.
All right. So one of the things that we talked about, or that you testified about regarding reading electric therapy, had to do with this idea of reflection of light, correct?
Correct.
What is an RFU?
An RFU is a measure of that intensity, the intensity of fluorescence in a particular sample, and it is proportional generally to the amount of DNA in that sample. So a high RFU value would give you would indicate a lot of DNA, therefore a lot of fluorescent molecules on the sample.
And when you described how the instrument or machine worked, a genetic analyzer in general, whether it was a 310 or any other instrument, you mentioned something about a dye. Can you tell us how the instrument works in terms of, when we're talking about RFUs, is that a reflection of the light given off by the DNA? What is it?
It's a measurement of the amount of light given off by the DNA as it comes out of the bottom of the capillary in front of the laser. The laser excites the dye molecules, they give off photons of light that's captured by the instrument, and so it effectively is like a meter you would use to measure the intensity of light in this room versus when they're on versus when they're off.
So, and that would generate the height of the peak.
That's correct.
And I think that's one of the factors you consider.
That's correct.
Is it the controlling factor?
It's not. I mean, you have the peak height. That's part of the morphology of the peak, the location of the peak, all of those other things that you look at in a sample. All of that works together to give you the result, not just one thing or not another thing.
Now, during the course of this hearing, I think you indicated that your analysis involved two different RFU levels. Is that correct? In
Yes.
other words, you were presented with evidence and you considered things at two different levels.
Yes.
Can you remind the court, please, what were those levels?
One is called the analytical threshold, and that basically is the lowest level at which, if I see a peak at that level or higher, that in fact we would consider that peak to be real, right? So at the point at which an amount of fluorescence rises above the analytical threshold, that peak is real.
That's what you're going to start counting as potential human DNA.
That's
if it's
correct.
in the right location and right surface.
That's correct. And depending on how your laboratory validates, that's going to be something approximately 2 times your highest noise level.
Well, that's interesting, because there was some testimony. You didn't do the validation on the BSO machines.
No, I did not.
When there's discussion about what you can look at, whether it's, do you know what the 2 RFU levels were that you used, that you were considering?
For the BSO data, where they ran the data and analyzed it in their laboratory, it was 150 RFUs for heterozygotes, 300 RFUs for homozygotes. If it was for the data that Mr. Keel analyzed when he developed and put his own electropherograms together, either analyzing BSO or his own work, then it was 50 RFUs, which is what he ran on his machines.
I want to be clear on the level for RFUs. Let me ask you this. SWGAM, that's the scientific working group, right? SWG, whatever.
Correct.
You recall testimony here today about something they put out in 2010 guidelines.
Yes,
Would you know them if you saw them?
I would.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Sweet.
Would you know them if you saw them? As in the actual 2010 guidelines?
Yeah, they're in there, yeah.
Actually, they're not. The 2014 probabilistic is, but these are the 2010 that actually are the things that guide how to do it. I'd like to have this marked. This is going to be states N, if I'm correct. Tell me if you recognize that document.
Yes.
Are those the 2010 appropriate guidelines from the Scientific Working Group on DNA analysis methods?
Yes.
Judge, I'd offer those into evidence.
marked as
M?
states M for identification are coming to states 12.
Stage what is it?
12,
Thank you.
1 plus 11. 13 minus 1.
Don't do math, I'll get confused. All right. Stage 12. For all the talk that's been going on in these hearings about the 2010 guidelines, can you tell me, does the 2010 Sweet Dam guidelines give you a specific RFU threshold to consider for analytic?
It does not.
Does it give us any guidance as to how somebody should properly analyze a machine or validate a machine for an analytical threshold?
It does do that.
Would you go to page 3 and Judge, he's looking at what is the copy and evidence, I'll give a courtesy copy of the court. Actually, I have one for you and one for Carolyn, if you want to.
Now,
We
nice.
can share.
Okay,
We share. Well,
page 3 for me,
All right?
portion that it begins with the heading, preliminary evaluation of data.
Preliminary evaluation,
Of data, D-A-T-A. All right, are you where I am?
I am?
There is a section specifically identified as analytical threshold. I believe it's 1.1 in the Squid Dam guidelines.
Correct.
Would you read into the record, please, 1.1?
Section 1.1, analytical threshold. The laboratory should establish an analytical threshold based on signal-to-noise analysis of internally derived empirical data. As an example, an analytical threshold may be based on 2 times the intensity difference between the highest peak and the lowest trough within the instrument noise data. Other scientific methods may be used. The usage of an analytical threshold value that differs substantially from manufacturer's recommendations should be supported by internal signal-to-noise assessments.
With respect to the ABI 310 genetic analyzer, based on your work at Bowie and your training and experience, how familiar are you with that particular machine or instrument?
Very familiar.
But every instrument is different, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you tell the court for an ABI 310, what is a noise level? What is it, where do you find it, and what is the range of a noise level?
The noise level is, it can be as low as 0 in terms of what the instrument can actually measure and sense. And it might be in the 15 RFU value on the high end, sometimes higher depending on the machine. But you simply run the machine without DNA in it and look to see what that is. And you can substantially zoom in on that baseline, and you're measuring the baseline electronic background of the machine, if you will. That's what you need to know.
When you're validating a machine, an instrument, and you're considering noise levels, is there any way to set an analytical threshold that's useful, high enough to exclude all noise?
No. I mean, what you do is you set an analytical threshold that gives you a 99% probability of being above all noise. But you can have a particular sample, the machine could act erratically for some reason, and that noise level may rise above what you would thought your analytical threshold was. Again, as part of what you analyze when you look at every sample and you catalog the information from the results of that sample.
So, in order to be 99.9% certain, assuming we can never be perfect, what is the baseline noise level for an ABI 310?
Typically, it's set at 50 RFUs. That tends to be the typical value that I look at, that I've seen in the machines that I've worked with.
Was that the analytical threshold you just gave us?
Yes.
Listen to let me rephrase my question. I'm asking you about noise level. What is the typical noise level, the high-end range, at 99.9% accuracy? What is the high-end noise level for an ABI 310?
I would say the high end comes somewhere in between 15 and 20 RFUs.
If you follow the SWIG-DAM guidelines that say to use twice the difference between the highest peak and the lowest trough, it must be clear, lowest trough in every case will be?
0.
Okay. So if you use lowest trough to highest peak, and you go to 20, what's 20 times 2?
40.
When you validated your machines at Bodie, what was your analytical threshold?
Our analytical thresholds at Bodie were 50 RFU.
That's more than twice the high end of the baseline.
Yes.
Based on what you've testified to regarding the SWIG-DAM guidelines, your training, experience, and validating the instrument machines, did you agree with the defense-retained expert Alan Keel that 50 RFUs is a scientifically sound analytical threshold to read the electrophorograms in this case?
I did.
You mentioned that there were 2 thresholds. We talked about the analytical. Let me ask you about the stochastic. Is the stochastic higher or lower?
The stochastic threshold is above the analytical threshold.
So, on my stupid little drawing, assuming that this is the bottom, and you know what, I did this really badly because I can't even see the judge behind the computer. So,
That works for me. I can see it, by the way.
can you? Okay. If this is the bottom, all right, and you're going to set, let's say we're using 50 RFUs, and here's 50 RFUs, and no, I'm not doing a straight across, but who cares, that's basically it, all right? The stochastic's going to be higher?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's going to be, let's say artificially what? Give me an acceptable stochastic range.
Stochastic range will depend entirely upon the machine. Typically, validated values for stochastic ranges can be anywhere from 125 RFU to 225 or 250 RFU.
Let's just say 200, artificial number, all right?
All right?
And we'll call this the stochastic, and we'll call this analytical. I thought you told me that the analytical is what you can use to start considering.
Yes.
Well, help me understand this. Stochastic, what's that for again? Why do we have that?
The stochastic threshold is the point at which you have done validation that suggests that 99.9 or 99% of the data that's above the stochastic threshold, you would not necessarily expect to see drop in or drop out. That is, you won't get some random effect that you may not be able to explain. So the distance between analytical and stochastic is an area that says pay special attention.
Are you telling me that all kinds of bad things can happen between a stochastic and an analytical threshold, and you're just going to read through it?
No, what I'm telling you is that you're going to have real data above analytical that will be below stochastic, and you need to be careful and diligent in your analysis of that information to make sure that you're accounting for things like drop in and drop out as you do your analysis.
Even above stochastic, you said 99.9%. Even above stochastic, stuff can happen, right?
Sure,
Science is not perfect.
science is not perfect.
So, if you're considering stuff below stochastic, is it your testimony is you have to read that very carefully?
Yes,
Well, why don't we just make it perfect? Why don't we just take the analytical threshold and push it up to stochastic so we can get to 99% efficiency for being able to read? Why don't we do that?
largely because you throw away lots of important data, and primarily you would probably be throwing away data that would exclude somebody if they were excluded from that sample. And in fact, what we're trained to do is we may even look below analytical if there's the appearance of human DNA even though it's below analytical. And you can think about it this way. If I have an analytical threshold of 50 RFUs and I have a peak at 50 RFUs, I'm saying that's good data. Does that mean that the peak at 49 RFUs isn't good data? No, of course it doesn't. But suppose that peak below 50 RFUs excluded the person you're comparing. Well, then you would use that to exclude that person. You wouldn't use to include, you wouldn't use it in statistics, you wouldn't use it for anything else, but if it excluded that person, you would in fact use it.
So consistent, do the Swig Dam guidelines and the other things that tell you how to evaluate, tell you that the information you can use for exclusion is a much wider range?
Yes, in fact, that's exactly what you're supposed to do, is consider things you wouldn't otherwise consider for inclusion, you would still use them for exclusion.
So if someone testifies, comes in and explains that you should never consider information below a stochastic threshold, would that be a correct statement according to Swig Dam guidelines and the National Research Council?
No, it would not.
Let's go ahead for a moment to just that, the National Research Council. Are you familiar with the National Academy of Sciences?
Yes.
Are they, I don't want to say their publications are the Bible, but are they, how valuable are they in terms of forensic assessments in this country?
They're considered extremely valuable. They're a reference literature that we rely upon.
Now, there's been some testimony here regarding reports from the National Research Council in 1992 and 1996. Are you familiar with those?
I am.
Can you just give the court an understanding of what were they?
The 92 National Research Council report was sort of the first attempt at the NRC to evaluate forensic, the use of DNA in forensics. Our first cases in forensic DNA were in 1986, 1987, and it was clear by 1992 that laboratories like mine that had been doing it since the beginning were having an impact. So the NRC got people together to assess this. In 1996, the Research Council focused more specifically on the population genetics and the mathematical assessment of the data and interpretation than the 92 Research Council did. And so very often we refer to the 96 report as NRC2, and NRC2 is what we consider for doing the mathematics and the interpretation.
With respect to doing the mathematics and interpretation, does the NRC preclude the use of the word odds in making an assessment?
No, actually, the NRC2 actually uses the word odds, if I recall correctly.
With respect to, and I think there's been some testimony about the difference in statistics that different people use. Do you recall if the National Research Council addresses this issue of varying statistics from experts?
It does, actually. One of the issues that had arisen by 1996 was this issue that we had experts that were giving odds that were remarkably conservative, and were using mathematical approaches that came up with very low numbers. And we had other people that were, like myself, who were striving to use more precise population genetics theory and calculations, in fact, the calculations that are now used today all the time, to arrive at a fairly precise estimate of how often you would expect to find a DNA profile in the population. And because of that, NRC2 did discuss that.
Do you remember an example involving the distance between the state of New York and the state of California?
Yes.
Do you have an independent recollection of how that is?
Yes.
Can you give us, can you tell the court, according to the National Research Council, and describe for us, I think there were 3 different estimates, is that correct?
Right. What that discussion was, and it was part of this overall discussion, effectively what they said is you can make the following statements, all of which are true. The distance between New York and California is greater than 2,000 miles. That's true. You can say the distance between New York and California is greater than 1,000 miles. Again, both statements exactly correct. You can make the statement it's more than 100 miles from New York to California. Again, that is a correct statement, but you've gotten so conservative that now you have created the possibility of an incorrect judgment based on that information. And I believe what they use is that somebody who used the 100-mile estimate may incorrectly believe that they could drive from New York to California on a single tank of gas. The point they were making was that alternative assessments of the probability or the odds, depending on your calculation, were those of the experts, and they were all correct, even though the numbers were different.
As it relates to the varying evaluations that you did, if I remember correctly, you did 2 reports, or did you do only 1?
2, as I recall. There was a first report on the BSO data and Mr. Keel's analysis of the BSO data that included some of his own analysis, and then a subsequent report on a specific piece of evidence.
When you were looking at 50 RFUs, and you were using the standard that Mr. Keel used, did you identify anybody new that wasn't at the 150 level?
No, I did not.
Did you see anybody magically drop out when you went to the 50 RFU level?
I did not.
According to the National Research Council, the varying different numbers that all of these experts can come to is not a reflection of science or methodology at all.
Object to counsel testify.
According to the National Research Council, is the differing statistics between experts a reflection of the reliability of science or methodology?
No, that was exactly their point, that everybody may have a mathematically independent assessment of the same item of evidence, but that in fact, everybody, in order to get to that assessment, had included that individual. So whether or not the number was 100 or 2,000, is the case of miles, all of those assessments were equally valid.
Now, one of the other things that was discussed in terms of, let's be candid, we've seen some numbers that differ from millions to quintillions, correct?
Correct.
When you are considering which loci to use, are they all of equal value?
They are not. I mean, a locus that has a very small distribution of alleles and/or alleles that are very common in the population will have less weight than a locus that has alleles that are more widely distributed in the population, more evenly distributed in the population.
So let's go back to your example from the first time you talked about it. Correct me if I'm wrong, you were comparing the likelihood of seeing a blue Ford go by the courthouse
Correct.
as opposed to some kind of expensive car that I cannot remember the name of.
I believe it's a 1955 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud.
Okay. So when you're talking about a particular allele at a particular locus, one could be as is it true that one could be as common for a Ford and one as uncommon as a silver cloud?
Correct.
And is that what you're talking about when you say all are not weighted equal?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
So if one scientist sees something at a particular allele and makes the judgment and that call, it has a huge impact on the numbers.
Yes, it can have a huge impact, or it may have a minimal impact if it turns out they're using one that's fairly common.
With respect to that and making a decision on what to call, there's been some discussion about calling a major. Again, the use of the term major, we're talking about a major profile?
Yes, we're talking about a profile that appears to be to have more DNA or higher RFU values than other profiles in a mixture.
Do you recall if the SWIG-GAM guidelines make any reference to how to call a major?
I don't recall because they don't make a specific, they don't give you a specific technique for how to call a major.
I can have 1 second, Judge.
Sure.
I had a highlighted copy that I was looking for. No, actually, it's my own highlighted copy.
Okay.
For some reason. All right. If you would,